You know, Sam, when we look at the Bible, especially the teachings of Jesus, I think it's pretty clear that he always teaches us to abstain from violence. In the Old Testament, especially with the backdrop of what we've read in Violence in Scripture by Creach, we can see that the violence we see in Scripture, even going like off the ban and stuff, is not as straightforward and black as white as what we used to think.
See how the Israelite people were mostly oppressed and never in a position of power to do that violent acts, really.
It does, which brings up the question, what do we do about in the army?
Now, should Christians be in the army?
I got it, I'm right here.
Oh. Hey, Peter.
Watch your tongue or have it cut from your head. Save your life by keeping with.
Sorry guys, that was my wife.
Can you be a Christian if you're in the army, though?
I would argue, yes you can. Yes, you're right. God is working his restorative violence. But who is God using to act that violence out? There are very few cases, the flood being one, where God is the only actor in that, right? So God made the earth flood. That was violence. It's clearly from God. But then we have a lot of other instances, like the Israelites going into Jericho, where God says, this is my plan, and you will be the ones doing it.
How about if we do take that example of Jericho, since you brought it up, what did the people do? They just marched around the city initially, right? And that's what God commanded. He only commanded them to march around the city, and the walls fell down. It was only God's action of violence. Their only responsibility was to march around.
But we've got to understand the context of that. We read in Creach, the context of when the book of Joshua was written really begs the question of, was Israel actually capable of these acts of violence? Did they actually happen? Or is it a bit of an exaggerated retelling?
Right. But then if we look at, other instances, like David and Goliath. I mean, it's your classic Bible story, but let's be real. David killed Goliath, and that was a violent act. And even in that one, God didn't even say, hey, David, I want you to do this. It was David seeing a national security crisis, right? The Philistines marching upon the Israelites, and no one was willing to do anything. And he's like, okay, I'm going to kill this guy, but I'm going to trust in God to, work through this. But he didn't get a voice from heaven telling him to do that. So, I mean, how do you respond to that?
I'd say clearly we can say that God didn't praise him for that or reject him for that, right? For that incident of David and Goliath. But later on in his life, when David's thinking about building the temple, you can clearly see that God rejects him from building the temple because he's he's a warrior guy. So there's blood on his hand, and God says, no, you can't build my temple.
Right, but what makes you say that not allowing him to build the temple was a punishment? Maybe it was God just closing the door. Can you really say that God denying him the chance to build the temple was a punishment? Or just, you're a man of war, you're not the man to build my temple?
So I think there's just always this unrest that the Bible kind of leaves us with, that even though these things happen, people try to establish it, that it's never set right, how the world should be. And I think Jesus comes on the stage in the New Testament and shows us that it does, that he actually fulfills that to what the world should look like.
So you think that God no longer works through restorative violence?
I don't think Christians should be involved in that restorative violence because I don't think we have the authority to carry out that perfectly in God's eye.
How does God enact this violence? I'm not saying that God can't do acts like the flood or even work through non-believing nations, but in today's modern world, how would you say if Christians are not involved in these restorative violent acts, then in what ways does God carry them out?
Like right now, I don't think Christians should be involved in the military, rather being peace agents and going out and helping the hurted and the oppressed communities around the world.
But then the question comes can you always best help through these peaceful measures, or are there some instances where violence against bad people, violence against other violent people, is the best way to protect and serve these oppressed societies?
And then if there is a people group who is specifically targeting everyone else or a specific group of people and being evil towards them, I guess it would be my trusting and my praying that God would do something to interact that situation.
I have an interesting story about this.
Right.
Bonhoeffer became involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. Arguably a person where violent acts against that person could be considered A-okay. Bonhoeffer himself believed that because he was willing to do this, he feared that he would end up in hell. But yet, Bonhoeffer believed that despite there being no other options, he could not still be seen as, I don't know if you want to, a Christian, a child of God, whatever you want to call it, because he decided to enact in this violent assassination.
I don't think that we should take human life lightly. And I know that there are those who do, and that is wrong. That because of the fall, there is violence, and because there is violence, there need to be those who are willing to stand up against that violence, even with the means of other violence. I look at the Bonhoeffer example, and I see someone who saw a violent act as the last option, the last viable option for taking out this great evil, Hitler. And he made the sadly necessary decision to go through with it.
So then the question becomes, was it necessary? Because they failed.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
At the end of the day, it really does come down to the fact that I feel very convicted that I should be in the military. Reason being, I cannot stand here and look at these atrocities being carried out against them by people who have no care for human life and not do anything myself. So therefore, I've decided to become a person in the military specifically because I feel called to be someone to make those unfortunate, hard decisions in order that I might defend human life, even if that means that I have to take human life to do that.
And I guess I'm left with my conviction when we see Jesus in the New Testament and his perfect example of clearly peaceful, nonviolent action, calling his disciples to follow that. So I interpret that saying that we're called to be absolutely peaceful and not be in military service that can lead to violence at all. And we should just rest in God's promises and trust in him that he'll take care of the world.
That's an important distinction to make too. We're not called to just stand by. We still act in the world. We just find a peaceful manner in which we can do it.
Correct. So then who wins?
Definitely me.
No, that.
No, but I had better
You know what?
arguments.
Okay, guys. You know what? There's clearly only one way we can decide this. Live by the coin. Indian head, Sam wins. Bird, Peter wins.
Okay.
Ready?
Yep.